Welcome to the geography of Greece. You take a look right here on the screen, you can see that it is just north of Africa, just west of the Middle East and the Asian continent. It is located in southern Europe, surrounded by the Aegean Sea and the Mediterranean. Let's talk about Earth. So, in our introduction, we've got a few things we got to remember. We should be familiar with the map by now and understand some of the physical characteristics in terms of the geography of Greece. So, in our timeline, we're talking about this time period from 750 BCE or before the Common Era up to 338 BCE. Now, remember, we're on the positive side of the timeline. These numbers would essentially be on the negative side of the timeline. So, this was a long time ago. Greece can be characterized as a peninsula that includes islands in the Aegean and Mediterranean seas. It has a lot of steep and rugged mountains, and we could say it is very influential in modern society in terms of philosophy, culture, and art. So we want to talk about the isolated communities and the trouble that they had essentially with travel. So we want to know, where did ancient Greeks mostly settle? If you said mostly near the water, you would be correct. Considering that the peninsula of Greece is surrounded on three sides by water and has a lot of islands, it should be no surprise that most of the people settled near the water. So why were ancient Greek communities isolated from each other, essentially set alone by themselves? Well, one of the big things was that travel was very difficult. With the mountains and all of the water, travel was very difficult unless you were very rich and owned horses and boats. So this is one of the main reasons why ancient Greek communities were ultimately isolated or set apart from each other. So we want to know what three or more reasons why travel was challenging in Greece. And I'll give you a couple. So whenever people traveled, they would travel in groups, moving relatively slowly. Travel by sea ultimately could be very dangerous due to things like storms. And most people had to walk over sharp, rocky terrain, which made it very difficult to move anywhere with relative ease. So let's talk about farming in ancient Greece. We've got a T-chart here that's going to give us some important information to help us understand how farming worked in ancient Greece. The first thing we'll do is we'll take a look at the challenges faced by farmers. Then we'll see how farmers ultimately met those challenges in order to sustain life in Greece. So some of the challenges that were faced by the farmers were things like the rocky terrain, like we've already talked about. That made growing anything very, very difficult. There were a lot of steep mountains, which ultimately meant that there was very little flat land to be able to grow anything or for any major livestock to be able to graze. There were no major rivers, so it made irrigation very, very difficult. Not to mention that it mostly rained in the winter months when crops ultimately wouldn't grow as easily. There was very little flat land, which means that there was very little land to grow certain crops, and it made it difficult for large grazing animals like cows to be able to live in these areas. So we want to know how farmers met those challenges. So what did they do despite all of these challenges? So a lot of farmers, they made olive oil from the olive trees that are all over Greece. They used this to trade and ultimately used for cooking and many other things. A lot of people raised bees for honey, which was a very hot commodity. It was something that a lot of people wanted because honey was the number one sweetener back during this time period. They would also flatten land for farming. With all the hills and mountains around, they would carve out areas that were flat so that they could grow small amounts of specific crops like wheats and other cereals. They also raised goats and sheep, which ultimately have been adapted to living in mountainous terrain. Okay, so these goats and sheep could navigate this area and graze in some of these steeper regions. So here's some pictures of how they would flatten some of the mountainsides and what they would do with the olive trees. They would grow things like grapes as well, along with raising honeybees and raising goats and sheep. So now we're going to shift gears and talk about how they started what are known as colonies. So the question is, what exactly is a colony? A colony is ultimately a settlement under the control of a distant country. So a way you could think about it is that Greece decided to send people to other places in order to do things like trade and expand the influence of ancient Greece. So the question is, why did ancient Greece set up colonies? Well, one of the main reasons was that ancient Greek communities were growing in size. There were simply too many people living in Greece. So what did they have to do about that? Well, ultimately they needed farmland to grow food for all these people. So then they decide that it's time to move and create colonies in order to have more farmland and send food and other things back to Greece. So another reason why ancient Greece set up colonies was for things like trade. And here we have a map that I want you to take a close look at. There's a lot of good information indicated on this particular map. If you take a look at the top, what we have here is the title. The title is Ancient Greek Colonies and Trade Routes around about 500 BCE, so within the timeline that we've talked about. Now if you notice, we see the Mediterranean Sea and the Black Sea and surrounding areas of Greece. Now if you take a look down here at the key, what you're going to notice is that there's a lot of information that will help us understand what's going on in this map. The orange areas indicate Greek settlements and colonies. The red arrows indicate the trade routes from these places back to Greece. They would trade things like gold and silver, grain, timber, iron, and wool. And this was one of the main reasons why so many Greek colonies were popping up all around the Mediterranean Sea and Black Sea area. The time period of colonization in Greece was from about 1000 BCE to about 650 BCE. So we're talking a time period of about 300 years. So what did ancient Greeks do prior to setting up colonies? So we want to know what was the process that they would go through in order to set up these colonies or settlements. So one of the main things that they did was they would consult or ask the oracle to determine if starting a colony was the right decision. Well, what the heck is an oracle? Well, think about it like this. An oracle is very similar to any type of religious leader, like a rabbi, a priest, a minister, an imam, a shaman, or even a Buddhist monk. So they would ask their spiritual leader, known as an oracle, if starting a colony ultimately was the right decision. Some other things that they did was they would ultimately gather food and tools and other supplies to get ready for their journey. So ultimately it was like any other journey that people go on. Another thing that they did is that they would light what was called a sacred fire from their town to bring with them. Every town had this sacred fire that had religious aspects attached to it. And they would take a fire lit from the sacred fire and bring it with them to their colony as a symbol of their religion and hopefully extending the Greek culture. So we're going to talk now about trading for needed goods. We talked about some of these things, but let's get into understanding what it was. So one of the main things you need to understand about this is that the ships that were used in Greece were very slow and big. They weren't designed for speed. They were ultimately designed to carry a lot of stuff. Now, they weren't very good at navigation, so they had to do things like depend on the stars and the things around them. But they would go back and forth around Greece to the different city-states and the different colonies in this region. They would trade for things like food, pottery, and a lot of other things too that would help continue a thriving country and colony. So to recap some of the main things that you're going to need to know about the geography of ancient Greece is this. There was a lot of mountains and water that surround Greece and make up the physical geography of Greece. The farmers adapted their farming methods to some of the obstacles that they faced. Things like the mountains, lack of rivers, and other things that would have made farming a little bit easier. They also established colonies for farmland and trading. With too many people, they simply needed to expand in order to make sure that their country would not fall. The last thing is that we need to know about the colonies and that they traded with Greece. Okay? The colonies were set up to support the Greek mainland, and what we see is that people ultimately traded their goods from place to place in order to thrive and survive. So this is the information that you need to know for the test. Make sure that you go back to the movie if you need to review some more of this information. And we'll continue talking about ancient Greece and some of its influence in the modern world.